What is the historical evidence for Jesus? If you miss those messages, we have them up online. You can find those. There's a link at the top of the sermon note side of your bulletin. We also have a podcast, so if you want to listen to the audio on the way to work or while you're working out or working in the home, that's available for you as well. Today, we're going to deal with this question: what about other religions? Next slide, please. What about other religions? There it is. And this is an incredibly relevant question for us because we live in an increasingly connected world where you either work with somebody or maybe you dated someone or you're friends with someone or at least you've read about other faith traditions and people that have different beliefs than you have or that you've grown up with. And that brings up a whole bunch of questions. You wonder about their faith traditions. It brings up questions about your faith tradition. And if you're a Christian, and I realize that not everybody's necessarily a Christian, and you're in a safe place, this is a place where you can ask questions and have doubts. But as Christians, this is a very important question for us. How should we respond, and how should we think about other faith traditions, other religions? Now, I want to begin by talking about what we're talking about when we say other religions. I turned to Pew Research, which has a massive study about global religions, and they cite these 5 religions as the 5 largest religions. Christianity is about a third of the global population. Islam is about a quarter of the global population. Hinduism is at 15%, Buddhism 7%, Judaism 0.2%. You might not be able to see the decimal point. But these are the 5 major religions. And then Pew goes into an analysis about a bunch of other religions. Here's some more of them. The Baha'i faith, Jainism, Shintoism, Taoism, Wiccan faith. You could add Native American religions to that, African religions, other folk religions. They even talk about atheists and agnostics who would say, I'm not religious, but from a sociological point of view, they are, because religion is a set of assumptions and beliefs that organize how we see the world. So an atheist and an agnostic has something like that. So there's more. There's much, much more. And then we know actually within these big categories, there's subcategories. So within Islam, there's Shiite and Sunni Muslim. Or within Christianity, there's these 3 major categories. Catholics represent about half the global population of Christians. The Protestants represent about a third of the global population. Orthodox faith is about 11, 12%. And then there's some smaller versions of Christianity. Some would say these aren't Christianity. Others would say that they are. But some examples would be like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witness. I'm not here to debate that, but Pew puts them under the bracket of Christianity. So we have these major divisions, and there's a bunch of smaller subsets. Now, within Catholicism, we all think that it's the Roman Catholic Church, but that's not true. There's subdivisions of that subdivision. In fact, there's the independent Catholic movement. Ryan Cox, our administrator, leads an independent Catholic church that worships here at 6 o'clock on Sundays. Within the Protestant faith tradition, which is the faith tradition I come out of, that our church comes out of, there's some subcategories as well. Pew has the evangelicals, the mainlines, and then the historically black congregations like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME. Within the mainline church, there's some subdivisions there as well. Here's just a few of them. There's the Baptists, the Lutherans, the non-denominational, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Restorationists, which is where the Disciples of Christ comes out of. We have some DOC folk here. And then the Congregationalists, which is what the United Church of Christ comes out of. Just a real quick thing about Congregationalists. What that means is that the authority for decision-making resides in the local congregation. And so we, as a Congregationalist church in the United Church of Christ, we have the authority about how we're going to worship, to decide how we're going to worship. We have authority about how we're going to do our governance. You all have authority to call me as your pastor or dismiss me as a pastor. You don't need to get anybody's permission. That's sort of a good thing. And, we have authority to do church in the best possible way we feel called to in our context, which means within the United Church of Christ itself, there's some great diversity in how UCC churches function. So in light of all this, all these subsets and subsets of subsets and all this complexity, I got one question for you. Where should we start? Where should we start? When it comes to other religions, where should we start? Should it be a comparative analysis between Islam and Christians? And if so, is it Shiite or Sunni? Is it Catholics or is it Orthodox? Where should we start? Because it's really, really complex when we start talking about other faith traditions. Even within the United Church of Christ, our home denomination, there is some diversity in belief. Where should we start? So I have an idea. I think we should start in the Gospel of John. If you're new to the Bible, there's two major sets, or two major divisions. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And within the New Testament, there's 27 books. That's what those boxes represent. The first four are the accounts of the life of Jesus. The blue is the book of Acts, which is the historical account of the early church. All the yellow are the letters that are ascribed to the Apostle Paul. The green are some more letters. Does anybody know what the purple is? Come on now, Revelation, right? The final book, which we talked about in the fall. And I'm going to start us in the Gospel of John when it comes to this question, what about other religions? Because John says something at the beginning of his Gospel, beginning of his account of the life of Jesus, that I think is helpful. And it leads us to an important distinction. So here's what John says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Before all the divisions, before the holy texts, before the temples, before the holy wars and the priesthoods, before Hinduism and Islam, before Jesus and Moses, before it all, in the beginning, there was just one thing. And John calls it the Word, Logos, this force, this creative power. He goes on. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light to all humankind. In the beginning, there was a creative force, and it brought life, and it brought light. Light being it showed us the way. It created clarity. It created understanding of purpose. Before all the different religions, their subsets, and all the wars, and all the political pundits, and all the difficulty that we face, in the beginning, there was a single thing, John says. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Now, this is actually good news, because what John is saying, that it's possible, even probable, that you won't recognize the true light. Now, this is good news because I just imagine there's one or two of you that have made a mistake in your life. I imagine that there's one or two of you that wonder, what is the purpose of life? Is there meaning? There's one or two of you here that would look back at a period in your own life and be like, man, I had my priorities misplaced. Am I the only one that would identify with that, right? We have a few hands, a few shakes of the heads. Yeah, right? So it's probable. It's not just possible, it's even probable that at points in our lives, we just won't get it. And that's good news because it means you're not alone in this. But it's also possible that at some point in time, you will understand. John goes on. He says, yet to all who did receive him, who did get it, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Meaning, people who are enlightened, people who understand, people who live with a purpose, people who live in the truth, people who are saved, people that are going to heaven. He gave the right to become children of God. Once you finally understand this one way, you get the right to become children of God. Now, the next section I almost passed by because it's kind of confusing. I really don't like the NIV's translation. It's kind of offensive to me. But I almost passed it by, but then I dug back in. I was curious about it, and I'm glad I did because John actually offers a critique of other religions. And not like naming them, but what's behind them. So I'm going to show it to you, then I'll explain it. Here's what he says. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. So let me break this down for you. So 3 ways it does not work. 3 ways that you do not become a child of God. 3 ways you don't become enlightened or you don't have a life that is full of meaning. Natural descent, human decision, human will. I retranslated that last one. So what's natural descent about? It's about this. It's about who you are. It's about your bloodline, your lineage. And this is the mindset that says that because of who I am, like the family I was born into or the race that I was born into or the people I was born into, that's what makes me right with God. And we are here just a few days away from Martin Luther King's birthday, right? We got Monday off, or some of you got Monday off for Martin Luther King's birthday. And what did MLK do? Well, he rose up against a mindset that said that because one group of people are a certain skin tone, or a certain race, that they're somehow better than everyone else. And John is saying, if that's your view, if you think that what makes you right with God is like what family you're born into or what race you are, then you don't get it. And this was pretty dramatic for John to say to the Israelites, who had a sense that because they were born to a certain kind of people, that that's what made them special. John says, that doesn't make it for you. He goes on to human decision. He says, this is about how much you want it. In other words, you can't just decide one day that, hey, I want to be a child of God, I want to be saved, I want to be enlightened. You just can't do it on your own. This is the kind of people that make up their own religion, who make up their own kind of way of things working. And John would say there's more to it than that. You can't just decide one day that you're in. Finally, human will. And this is about how hard you work, which is the most prevalent form of religion there is. It's about earning your way in. It's about following all the rules, doing enough good in the world. And John says no matter how hard you work, you can't earn your way in. You can't get in because of your bloodline. You can't just decide to be in, and you can't earn your way in. So how can we get in? How do we become children of God? What really works? John goes on to tell us. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory. You might have figured out he's starting to talk about Jesus. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, truth is in orange because we're going to come back to that. But let's talk about grace and this idea that he's full of grace, overflowing with grace. What is grace? Grace is simply unearned favor. It's unearned favor. You can't earn grace. The minute you try to earn it or you think you've earned it, it's no longer grace. And Jesus comes along and he's full to the brim, overflowing with this grace. And if you read the stories of his life, you'll encounter him feeding people, healing people, inviting people, spending time with people, not because they deserve it, but because he is filled with grace. And everywhere he goes, it changes people because grace changes people. John goes on, out of his fullness, Jesus' fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. So hold on a second. You're saying we got grace in place of grace? John said, yeah, let me explain a little bit more. He says, for the law was given through Moses, and grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, this is important to what John is trying to communicate to us. So he's saying that when Moses came with the law, that grace came. Or to put it another way, there was grace in the law given through Moses. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. Have any of you ever been in a work environment where it was very unclear what the rules were? It was very unclear what the goals were. And so you're there and you're working and you're putting in your hours, but you're not quite sure exactly what you're supposed to achieve, and you're not quite sure exactly what you're not supposed to do. And then you have a boss who sometimes is so easygoing and doesn't really care, and then other times the boss just comes down on you, and it's really, really frustrating because you didn't know what the rules were in the first place, so how can you get after me? That's a pretty hard place to be in. And then you go to a work environment where there are rules and there's structure, and it's almost like exhilarating to be there because at least you know what the rules are, at least you know what the structure is. And there's a certain amount of grace in those rules. You know what you're trying to do, you know what you're not supposed to do. And in the story of the Israelites, in the story of the Old Testament, God, he saves a group of people, the Israelites, from slavery in Egypt, and then he gives them a set of rules, an understanding of how they're supposed to behave. And John says there's a certain amount of grace in that. But then he also says this, the truth is, that's revealed through Jesus, is that the law, which had grace in it, it can't save you. The law can't save you. And if you read the Old Testament and the stories of the Israelites, it's just one story after another of these people trying to follow the law, trying to follow these rules. And there's a certain amount of grace in there, but they're trying to follow it and they can't do it. They all mess up. Every single one of them. One of the best of them, King David, the guy murders another man because he's stolen that man's wife. I mean, that's like one of the best that they have. Every one of them fails, and the truth revealed through Jesus is that following the rules, if that is the thing that you think is going to save you, that can't save you. You need something more. There's a little bit of grace in that law and those rules, but a little bit of grace is not enough. You need the fullness of grace. Now, the Apostle Paul, who's one of the major figures in the New Testament in the early church era, he comes onto the scene with a different name. He's called Saul with an S. And Saul with an S, he is a rule follower. He's somebody that is trying to follow the law of Moses, and he's really good at it. He's so good at it that he thinks he's almost perfect, and he wants everybody else to follow the law like him. And this group of Jesus followers come along, and they start creating all this trouble. And he sees them as a threat. And so he makes it his business to try to kill this movement, to try to squash it. And he goes around arresting followers of the way. And in one instance, he participates in the murder of one of the leaders of this movement, a man named Stephen. And then Saul has an experience of grace. He encounters the risen Lord, and it changes him. And he changes his name from Saul to Paul. And he later writes this in one of his letters. He says, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast. It is by grace that we are saved. It's by receiving this gift. It's all about receiving this gift. It's not by your works, so no one can boast." You know what happens when you live by works? It turns you into a certain kind of person. A person who's likely to boast, be filled with pride. And you know what happens when you receive the gift of grace? It turns you into a certain kind of person. A person that's going to extend grace. And if Paul was here, and he was confronted with the question, what about other religions? He would say, you know what? There's really only two. And I know that that's kind of offensive. And I know that we could show Paul the Pew Research, and what about all these different religions and all their subsets? He'd say, look, I'm aware of all that. There's a lot of religions in their day and age too. But he'd say, really, when you boil it down, there's really only two. There's works religion, and there's grace religion. It's not Christianity and everything else. Because there's plenty of Christianity out there that's living a works-based religion, trying to earn our way in. Yeah, we got some grace, but it's not a fullness of grace. We got some grace, and then we got a few rules you got to do too. It's works religion. Works religion asks this question: have I done enough? Grace religion makes this statement: I've been given more than enough. And each one of these will form you into a certain kind of person. Each one of these has consequences for how you see the world and how you live in the world. Each one of these has consequences for how you would think about other religions and treat them. Works religion, it first and foremost leads to pride. Because I'm trying to earn my way in. And some of us, we do a pretty good job. And so we look at others and we're like, hey, how come you haven't done it? I've done it. You could do it. And we're full with pride. And we got to be filled with pride, because behind the pride is a whole ton of fear. Because at the end of the day, we're never quite sure. Have I done enough? I think I have, but have I really? Have I done something this week that minus some of the things I did the week before? What's the total that I'm living at? And we're always obsessed with this question: have I done enough? It makes us prideful, and it makes us fearful. It makes us self-absorbed. Works religion. Find it all over Christianity. I'm sure it's in other world religions. I don't want to say much about things I don't know a whole lot about. But I know it is prevalent. Grace religion has the opposite effect. First, it leads to humility. Have you ever received a compliment from somebody and it was kind of hard to receive it? Right? Do you know anybody like that? Or it's hard to receive gifts? Because it takes some humility to receive a gift, doesn't it? And the bigger the gift, the more humility. And so when it comes to something that you absolutely need, something that means more than anything else, then that means that it's going to take even more humility. And the gospel is that God has given you a gift that you couldn't earn, but you absolutely need. You need it, but you can't work your way into it. You can't be born into it. And it takes humility. To put it another way, receiving the gift of grace requires the surrender of our control over our own salvation. And this is scandalous. This is what makes it hard to receive the gift, because we've got to give up control. I was talking about this with a neighbor, And he said to me, "Are you trying to tell me that what I do does not matter?" And I said, "Well, in terms of your eternal salvation, yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell you." He's like, I can't believe that. I can't believe that what I do doesn't matter. Well, what you do does matter because it has an effect on the world. I'm just saying that in terms of your eternal salvation, the gospel is that you've been given this gift and that it does something to you and it changes you and you got to surrender to it. And it is possible not to receive the gift, but the gift has been offered. And so you have to surrender. And if you can receive this gift, it brings something else. Confidence. Absolute confidence. You're humble and you're confident. If you were to ask me, "Scott, are you going to heaven when you die?" You know what my answer is? Yes. Yes. And you might think, "Wow, he is arrogant." Or you might think like, "Oh, he thinks that because he's a preacher, because he reads the Bible, he serves in the food pantry." You might think it's those reasons. And let me tell you, it's none of those reasons. It has nothing to do with me. It's because I've received the gift. I believe the gospel. It's grace. And I've surrendered myself to that, and it changes you. And so I don't fear failure as much. I just don't have as much fear ever since I surrendered to the gospel. I'm not in control. It changes you, and it makes you a force in this world. Paul says this, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works." Now, don't get that mixed up, because the way we think about it is that I do good works, and that leads to me being God's handiwork, right? That's works theology. I do the good works, and then I'm created in Jesus. But what Paul is saying is actually it's the reverse. I am created in Jesus. I've received the gift of grace, and that leads to the good works. Because it's possible to do good works for the wrong reasons. It's possible to help the poor or help the needy and end up becoming more prideful, isn't it? We've met people like that. Maybe we've been those people. But it's receiving the grace that changes your heart. And then you do the good works which God has prepared for you in advance. Your life is filled with purpose and meaning. Put it simply, only those who have received grace can give grace. And our lives are here to be light and salt in this world, to bring grace into a world, unearned favor. Because if we all had to earn it, we'd all be in trouble. But the thing that changes the world, that really makes a difference, is grace. Now, in recent history, if there's anybody that has brought grace in the world, Martin Luther King would be one of the obvious ones. And if you are familiar with this story, you would know that he is a Christian minister, that he led a movement filled with a bunch of other courageous men and women that went up against an apparatus, a structure of racism in our country, filled with a bunch of Christians, by the way, who believed that because they were white, they were better than other races. And King was brutalized by this system. His friends and family were brutalized by this system, yet he responded with grace. And we know that he didn't eradicate all racism in our country. We still have that issue, but it did make a huge difference, did it not? And King, he had experienced God's grace on many levels, and I read a bunch of his sermons recently, and he was talking about how he received grace, and he gave this kind of small little example of this time when he was in seminary. He went to seminary in Atlanta, and he took this course, and he ended up failing the course. You had to get an A or a B in the course, and he got a 75. A C was a failure. And everyone in his class also failed the course. And he said that the professor saw this issue. The professor knew that everybody had tried really hard, but they failed the course. And so the professor said, I figured I needed to do something about it. Because if you all failed, you can't graduate seminary. King's telling this story in one of his sermons during the Civil Rights era. And King says that he gets his blue book back. Anybody know what a blue book is? Yep, grad students know. Blue book is like a little blue book that they make you pay a bunch of money for some reason. It's really just paper inside. But when you're in grad school, I don't know if they still do it, you had to buy a blue book and you handwrite your exam responses. So he gets his blue book back, thinking he's failed out of seminary. And the blue book looks like this. There's a 75 at the top, Then it says grace, and there's a 10, and he gets a score of 85. King says that every one of his classmates, the same thing happened. And here's part of his response. He said, now he, the teacher, didn't have to do that. We didn't deserve it. We didn't merit that. But we so desperately needed it to pass that course and to finish that seminary. This is the meaning of God's grace, and that's the thing that brings us through life. This is what God gives us, and it only comes through his grace, his free gift. His free gift. And this is just a little story. King obviously had experienced much more grace than this, because he was able to respond to those that would take his life. He was able to respond to them with love. It doesn't mean that he backed down and sanctioned what they did, but he was respond to them with love. And one of his famous quotes, the one I probably admire the most, part of it goes like this. One day, we shall win freedom, not only for ourselves, we shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory. See, King believed that when you're racist, you're not free. When you see other people as inferior, you're not free. When you do violence against other people, you're not free. And King, earlier in the quote, says, we will match your capacity to do violence with our capacity to absorb it and suffer it. We'll never respond back with violence. We'll respond back with soul force. And we'll win a double victory. King understood God's grace and was able to be grace in this world, and it changed our world. So what about other religions? In case you thought I forgot about this question. What about other religions? And the answer is simple. It's grace. Unearned favor. So when it comes to other religions, followers of Jesus, we should give unearned favor to people that believe differently than us. We should treat them with as much respect, with as much graciousness as we possibly can, because we have received grace and we didn't earn it. But when it comes to the theological differences, the thing that really counts, the only thing that I personally am interested in, is grace. Does your thought system, does your religion lead you to grace? Or do you still got to earn part of it? Because when you got to earn part of it, it does something to you. But when you receive grace, it does something to you. And people that receive grace, they're able to give grace, and grace is what changes the world. Let us pray. God, I pray that each person here might surrender their control and receive your gift. That they might be able to answer the question, am I going to heaven? Am I a child of God? Have I been saved? Or whatever the language they need to use, with just a confident yes. That they'd be filled with the humility that comes along with saying that. And that they would have the confidence to risk themselves in the world in love, to be a source of grace, not to those who deserve it, but precisely those that don't. For that's what your son did. He came to us that didn't deserve it. And he gave it anyways. So we thank you for this gift. We thank you for your son, Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.
Why don't you guys go ahead and stand?